The Forbidden Encounter. The grand hall of celestial flames shimmered under the glow of floating crystal orbs. The royal palace of Typhoria was an architectural wonder, a fusion of organic and technological beauty. Tonight, it was filled with noble warriors, high-ranking officials, and the Emperor's elite guests. Among them stood a single human, Captain Ethan Cole. Ethan adjusted the collar of his formal diplomatic uniform, feeling out of place among the towering alien elites. Cyphorians were an imposing race, their golden eyes, iridescent skin, and towering frames making them seem almost godlike. They saw humans as weak, lesser beings, and most of them barely acknowledged his presence. Yet, there was one exception, Princess Lizara. Seated beside her father, the Emperor of Typhoria, Lizara stole curious glances at Ethan. He was different. Unlike the other diplomats she had met, he wasn't arrogant or desperate to prove himself. He stood with quiet confidence, his eyes sharp, scanning the room like a seasoned warrior. The banquet continued with strange alien delicacies and deep political discussions. Ethan remained silent, listening carefully. He knew humans had little influence in this room. The Typhorian Empire ruled over dozens of planets, while Earth was still struggling to secure its place among the stars. A sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. "Tell me, human." Lord Varric, one of the Emperor's most trusted generals, leaned forward with a smirk. "Do you truly believe your kind has any right to stand among us?" The hall fell silent. Many eyes turned toward Ethan, waiting for his reaction. Ethan met Varric's gaze. Unfazed. "Respect is earned, not given. I don't expect anything, Lord Varric. I only hope that, in time, we prove ourselves worthy of standing beside you, not beneath you." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some scoffed. Others observed him with newfound interest. Lizara's lips curved into the slightest smile. "He's brave," she thought. "Or foolish." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural humming sound filled the hall. Then, chaos erupted. The main doors burst open, and a group of masked assassins stormed inside, their weapons glowing with deadly plasma energy. "Protect the Emperor," shouted Varric, drawing his energy blade. Guards rushed forward, but the attackers were fast. Too fast. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He lunged forward, tackling Princess Lizara, just as a plasma bolt whizzed past her. The shot burned through the throne's golden frame, leaving a smoking hole where her head had been just seconds ago. Lizara gasped. "He saved me." The assassins closed in, moving with terrifying precision. The royal guards fought back, but these attackers weren't ordinary rebels. They were trained killers. Ethan grabbed a fallen weapon and fired, taking down two assassins with clean, precise shots. His military training from Earth's special forces was clear in his movements. But something was wrong. These attackers weren't after the Emperor. They were targeting Lizara. One assassin leaped at her, dagger raised. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of her, raising his arm. The blade sliced into his forearm, but he twisted, disarming the attacker in one swift motion. Blood dripped from his wound, but he didn't falter. He slammed the assassin into the ground, knocking them unconscious. Lizara stared in shock. No human should be this skilled. No human should risk their life for an alien princess. Varric and the other warriors fought fiercely, and within minutes, the last assassin fell to the ground, lifeless. The hall was left in silence, filled only with the heavy breathing of warriors. Ethan stepped back, clutching his bleeding arm. He looked around, his mind racing. Who sent these assassins? Why target the princess? The Emperor rose from his throne, his golden eyes narrowing. His voice was calm but cold. "Guards, seize the human." Ethan barely had time to react before a dozen elite warriors surrounded him, weapons drawn. Lizara's eyes widened. "Father, no. He saved my life." But the Emperor's gaze remained unreadable. "That may be true, but there are many questions that need answers." Ethan took a slow breath. He had just saved the princess, but now he was being treated like a criminal. Typical. Lizara clenched her fists. For the first time in her life, she questioned her father's decisions. Why was a human the only one who had acted to save her? And why did she suddenly feel like he was the only person she could trust? A bond that shouldn't exist. Ethan sat in the cold, dimly lit chamber, his hands bound by Cyphorian energy restraints. The material wasn't just metal. It pulsed with a strange, living energy that prevented any movement beyond a slight twitch of his fingers. His injured arm throbbed, but he ignored the pain. He had been in worse situations before, captured behind enemy lines, surrounded, left for dead. He had survived them all. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just a soldier fighting a war. He was a human, alone in a world that despised his kind, accused of a crime he didn't commit. And the only person who seemed to believe in him was an alien princess. The heavy doors slid open with a low hiss. Ethan lifted his head. Princess Lizara entered, her violet cloak trailing behind her. Her golden eyes flickered with an emotion he couldn't place. Anger, confusion, curiosity. Maybe all three. She stopped a few feet away, studying him like a puzzle she couldn't solve. "You are reckless," she said finally. Ethan smirked. "You're welcome, by the way." Lizara exhaled, stepping closer. "You shouldn't have done that. You'd be dead if I didn't." Silence. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension in the room was thick. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes, a war between what she had been taught and what she had just witnessed. Lizara's people saw humans as weak, as inferior. And yet, he had saved her. He had fought like a warrior, better than many Cyphorian soldiers she knew. Finally, she sighed and knelt beside him. A small device in her hand hummed as she pressed it against his wound. A soft, golden light pulsed from it, sealing the cut within seconds. Ethan blinked. "That's impressive. You don't need to flatter me. I meant the tech, not you." He grinned slightly. "But sure, you too." Lizara rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the faintest curve of her lips. "You are very strange, human." "It's Ethan." She hesitated. Ethan. The name felt foreign on her tongue. She stood, composing herself. "I want to know the truth. Were you involved in the attack?" Ethan's expression hardened. "No." Lizara studied him, searching for any sign of deception, but his eyes were steady, unwavering. "Then someone wanted me dead," she murmured. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Not your father. If they wanted the Emperor gone, they would have gone for him first. The assassins targeted you." Lizara stiffened. She knew he was right, but that made it worse. Someone within her own empire had tried to kill her, and she had no idea who. The hidden enemy. Lizara led Ethan through the dim corridors of the palace, her mind racing. If the assassins were truly after her, that meant someone inside the court had orchestrated it. The problem? There were too many suspects. Her father, the Emperor, ruled with an iron will. Not everyone agreed with his leadership, but most feared him too much to betray him. However, Lizara was different. She was seen as too soft, too curious about other species, too willing to question old traditions. And now she had a human following her through the palace like a shadow. "So, where are we going?" Ethan asked, keeping pace with her despite the restraints still locked around his wrists. "To someone who might help us." They entered a hidden passage beneath the palace. The air was thick with dust and old secrets. At the end of the passage, a sleek metal door slid open, revealing a dark chamber filled with ancient relics and glowing blue archives. Inside stood a figure, a young man, barely older than Ethan. His sharp silver eyes widened in shock as he saw them enter. Lizara, and a human. "Kalen," Lizara said, stepping forward. "I need your help." Ethan's gaze shifted between them. Another royal. But unlike the Emperor, Prince Kalen looked more scholar than warrior, his hands smudged with ink from years of studying forgotten texts. Kalen crossed his arms. You've brought a human into the royal archives. Are you out of your mind? Just listen to me. Lysara's voice was urgent. There was an assassination attempt. On me. Kalen's eyes darkened. Who? We don't know yet. Ethan cut in. But we need answers. Kalen hesitated, glancing between his sister and Ethan. Finally, he sighed and turned to the archives. With a flick of his fingers, holographic records filled the air, swirling like constellations. If someone tried to kill you, there has to be a reason, he muttered, scrolling through encrypted files. And if there's a reason, the answer is in here. As Kalen worked, Ethan turned to Lysara. You trust him? Lysara nodded. With my life. Ethan studied her for a moment. Then I'll trust him too. Kalen's fingers froze. His eyes widened. I found something. The screen zoomed in on a classified document, showing an image of a secret meeting between Typhorian officials and an unknown figure cloaked in shadows. But the most shocking detail was the date. It had been recorded months ago, long before the assassination attempt. Whoever was behind this had been planning it for a long time. Lysara's breath hitched. This wasn't just an attack. Ethan's jaw clenched. It was a warning. Kalen looked at them. Concern etched across his face. A warning for what? Ethan exhaled, his mind racing. That someone in your empire doesn't want peace with humans. They want war. The room fell into heavy silence, and deep in the palace, a hidden enemy watched through unseen eyes, already preparing their next move. The chase begins. The halls of the Typhorian palace were no longer safe. Princess Lysara walked briskly, her mind racing. The revelation from Kalen's archives had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The assassination attempt on her wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a strategic move, a calculated step toward war. And worse, someone in her own empire was behind it. She glanced over at Ethan, who strode beside her, his gaze sharp and unreadable. He was different from the humans she had read about in imperial records, strong, fearless, yet strangely calm in the face of danger. But was he truly an ally, or just another pawn in a much bigger game? Before she could dwell on the thought, a loud alarm echoed through the palace. Alert! Alert! The human prisoner has escaped custody. All warriors report to your stations. Lysara stiffened. Damn it. They knew. Ethan exhaled. That's not good. Lysara grabbed his wrist and pulled him forward. Run. The hunt begins. The sound of armored boots thundered through the palace corridors. Lysara led Ethan down a hidden passage, weaving through darkened halls lined with ancient murals of Typhoria's past. The flickering blue flames in the sconces cast eerie shadows on the walls. How many are after us? Ethan asked, keeping pace beside her. Too many. Lysara glanced back. And Varric is leading them. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. Of course he is. Lord Varric, the Emperor's fiercest general. The man who wanted Ethan dead the moment he stepped foot in this palace. And now he had the perfect excuse to kill him. The corridor opened into a vast ceremonial chamber with towering pillars and a massive stained glass window depicting Typhoria's gods. The glass shimmered, showing an endless view of the floating city below, suspended in the sky by ancient anti-gravity technology. Ethan paused for a second, taking in the sight. Even in the middle of a chase for his life, he had to admit it was beautiful. Lysara yanked him forward. No time to admire the scenery, human. A second later, blaster fire exploded behind them. They barely dodged the first barrage of deadly plasma shots. Ethan grabbed Lysara and spun behind a pillar, shielding her as energy bolts shattered the stone. He drew a stolen Typhorian plasma blade from his belt. It was heavier than he liked, but it would do. Across the chamber, Varric emerged, flanked by a squad of heavily armed warriors. The general sneered. You disgrace yourself, princess, betraying your people for a lesser being. Lysara stood her ground. I'm trying to save my people." Varric's golden eyes glowed with fury. "By siding with a human." Ethan smirked. "I get that a lot." Varric's expression darkened. He raised his hand, signaling his men to advance. "Surrender, and I promise to make your death quick." Ethan rolled his shoulders. "I think I'll pass." Lizara whispered to him, "We can't fight them all." "Then we don't." Ethan's eyes darted toward the stained glass window. Lizara followed his gaze. Her stomach dropped. "You are insane." "I've been told that before." Before Varric could give the order to fire, Ethan grabbed Lizara's hand and sprinted straight toward the massive window. "Stop them!" Varric roared. Blaster fire exploded behind them. Ethan leaped, pulling Lizara with him. The glass shattered as they crashed through, falling into open air, falling into the unknown. For a terrifying second, there was nothing but wind and weightlessness. Then, a sudden yank. Lizara gasped as Ethan activated a hidden gravity tether, a small human-made device strapped to his belt. It pulsed, slowing their descent just enough to stop them from splattering on the floating city's metallic platforms below. They crashed onto the roof of a sky transport, rolling across its curved surface before Ethan caught the edge, keeping them from tumbling off completely. Lizara clung to him, heart pounding in her chest. Ethan grinned. "Still think I'm insane?" She punched his arm. "You could have warned me." "Where's the fun in that?" Before she could argue, a fleet of patrol drones appeared above them, scanning the area. Lizara tensed. "They won't stop hunting us." Ethan nodded, already calculating their next move. "Then we keep running." The truth beneath the city. They slipped through the lower levels of the city, vanishing into the maze of neon-lit streets, underground tunnels, and abandoned districts. Lizara had never ventured this far down before. The floating city was built in layers. The elite lived at the top, while the unwanted were pushed to the underbelly. Here, the air was thick with smog, and alien refugees huddled in shadowed alleys, barely surviving. Ethan looked around, his jaw tightening. "So this is what your empire hides." Lizara remained silent. She had always known about the lower levels, but seeing them up close was different. An old Cyphorian woman, her skin scarred from years of hardship, watched them from the shadows. "Princess," she whispered, recognizing Lizara instantly. "What are you doing here?" Lizara hesitated, looking for answers. The woman's tired eyes shifted to Ethan. "And you trust a human to help you find them?" Lizara glanced at Ethan. He had risked his life for her twice in a single night. She met the old woman's gaze. "I trust him more than I trust my own people." A love that defies destiny. The underbelly of Cyphoria's floating city was a place of forgotten souls. Neon lights flickered weakly over rusted metal walkways, and the air was thick with the scent of oil, smog, and desperation. It was a far cry from the golden halls of the palace, where the elite dined on exotic delicacies, far removed from the suffering below. Ethan scanned the dark alleys, his military instincts on high alert. He and Princess Lizara had barely escaped with their lives. The Empire's soldiers would still be looking for them, led by Lord Varric, the man who saw Ethan as nothing more than a stain on Cyphoria's honor. They had gone from honored guests to fugitives in a matter of hours. Lizara moved beside him, her royal cloak discarded, replaced by a simple black tunic that made her look like any other wanderer in the lower districts. But even here, her golden eyes and regal presence made her stand out. She didn't belong in this world. And yet here she was, running, with a human. A choice she never thought she'd make. The whispered warning. They moved cautiously through the marketplace, where alien merchants sold strange wares, holographic maps of lost worlds, robotic pets that mimicked their owners, and weapons illegal even in the highest criminal sectors. A hooded figure approached them, moving through the crowd like a ghost. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the plasma pistol he had stolen during their escape. But before he could react, the figure spoke. "They're coming for you." Lizara stiffened. Who? The hood was lowered, revealing the scared face of an old Cyphorian woman, the same one who had recognized Lizara earlier. She glanced around as if the very walls were listening. The Emperor has given the order. They want you dead before sunrise. Ethan exhaled. Guess I shouldn't be surprised. Lizara's hands clenched into fists. He's my father. He wouldn't. He would. The woman's voice was sharp. The council is forcing his hand. He must choose between loyalty to you or loyalty to the Empire. Lizara's heart pounded. She had spent her entire life believing in duty, honor, and her father's wisdom. But now, she was the one being hunted, and the man she once trusted was signing her death sentence. There is no place for mercy in the Empire, the woman continued. You know this, Princess. Ethan stepped forward. Who's really pulling the strings? The woman hesitated. Lord Varric and the High Council. They see Lizara as a threat. They see peace with humans as a weakness, and they will destroy anything that stands in their way. A cold dread settled in Lizara's chest. Then we can't stay here, Ethan said. We need to leave the city. The old woman nodded. There's a smuggler in the lower docks. He can get you out. Lizara hesitated. Running meant exile. Running meant leaving everything she had ever known. But staying meant death. She turned to Ethan. Are you sure about this? He held her gaze. I swore I wouldn't leave you behind. Lizara's heart clenched. No one had ever said that to her before. And they had meant it. A dangerous escape. The docks were hidden beneath layers of ancient metal plating, a forgotten part of the city where criminals, outlaws, and unwanted refugees lived. Ethan and Lizara moved quickly, avoiding patrols as they reached an abandoned cargo bay. A sleek, rusted starship sat at the edge of the platform. A Zyphorian smuggler leaned against the hull, arms crossed. His mechanical eye whirred as he scanned them. You're late. His voice was rough, like someone who had spent too many years drinking starship fuel. Had a few distractions, Ethan muttered. The smuggler smirked. You want passage out of here. It's gonna cost you. Lizara stepped forward. Name your price. The smuggler's eyes glowed with greed. Royalty is valuable in any system. I could turn you in and make a fortune. Ethan stepped in front of her, his plasma blade humming to life. You could try. A tense silence. Then the smuggler laughed. I like you, human. He gestured toward the ship. Get in. They moved quickly, climbing aboard. Lizara barely had time to sit before the ship lurched upward, engines roaring to life. Then, a deafening explosion. The docking platform erupted in flames. Enemy ships swarmed the airspace, sirens blaring. Ethan cursed. They found us. Varric's voice crackled over the comms. Lizara, surrender now. Don't make this worse. Lizara's hands shook. She knew what this meant. If they were captured now, there would be no second chance. She turned to Ethan. We fight. Ethan grinned. Thought you'd never say it. The ship's weapons powered up, and the battle for their freedom began. The moment that changed everything. The battle raged in the skies above Typhoria. Ethan and Lizara fought side by side, taking down enemy ships as they raced toward the atmosphere's edge. But it wasn't just survival anymore. Something had shifted between them. As the ship dodged another barrage of enemy fire, Lizara turned to Ethan, her breath uneven. If we make it out of this, what happens next? She asked. Ethan met her gaze, the chaos around them fading for a brief second. We figure it out together. Lizara had spent her whole life believing that duty was her destiny, that her future was written in stone. But for the first time, she realized, maybe destiny was a choice, and she had already made hers. She wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. The betrayal. The starship shuddered as another plasma blast slammed into its hull. The alarms blared, red warning lights flashing across the cockpit. Ethan gritted his teeth, gripping the controls tightly. "Hold on." Princess Lizara braced herself against the side panel as the ship spiraled through Cyphoria's upper atmosphere, chased by two sleek royal interceptors. Lord Varric's fleet was relentless, their Hunter-class fighters designed for one thing: pursuing and eliminating fugitives. Lizara's heart pounded as the ship jolted from another impact. "Shields at 30%. We can't outrun them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We don't need to outrun them." His fingers danced over the controls. With a sudden flick of a switch, he cut all power to the engines. The ship lurched violently, dropping like a dead weight toward the vast crimson dunes of Typhoria's lower wastelands. The pursuing ships hesitated, adjusting their trajectory, and that moment of hesitation was all Ethan needed. At the last second, he reactivated the engines, sending the ship into a sharp, unexpected turn. The nearest interceptor overshot their position, and Ethan fired the rear cannons, obliterating it in a single blast. Lizara stared, breathless. That was insane. Ethan grinned. "You're welcome." But before they could celebrate, the second interceptor locked onto them. A direct hit to their thrusters sent the ship spinning out of control, flames licking at the engines. They were crashing. The fall to ruin. The ship slammed into the desert, skidding across the burning sand before coming to a stop at the edge of a canyon. Smoke and fire hissed from the damaged engines. Lizara coughed, pushing herself up. Her limbs ached, but she was alive. Ethan groaned from the pilot's chair, rubbing his forehead. That could have gone better. Lizara turned toward him, exasperated. "You call that better? We're stranded in the wastelands." Ethan chuckled. "Hey, we're not dead. That's a win in my book." Before she could reply, a deep rumbling sound echoed across the canyon. A shadow loomed over them. A transport, and at the front, standing tall, was Lord Varric. Lizara's blood ran cold. They had been waiting. It was a trap. Varric's voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Surrender, princess. You have nowhere left to run." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, already reaching for his plasma pistol. Lizara did the same, but she knew the truth. They were outnumbered and outgunned. And worst of all, someone had betrayed them. The betrayal revealed. Varric stepped forward, his golden eyes gleaming with triumph. "Did you really think you could escape, Lizara?" Lizara gritted her teeth. "How did you find us?" Varric smirked. "You should ask your dear brother." Lizara's breath caught. Callan. A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Prince Callan. His silver eyes were filled with guilt, but there was no mistaking what he had done. He had led them here. Lizara took a step back, shaking her head. "No, you wouldn't." Callan's voice was barely above a whisper. "I had no choice. You betrayed me." Asterisk, asterisk. Her voice wavered, raw with hurt. Asterisk, asterisk. Callan clenched his fists. "I didn't want to, Lizara. But you left me no choice. The council threatened to destroy the lower districts if I helped you escape. If I gave them your location, they promised to spare the people." Lizara's heart pounded. She had spent her life believing her family would always stand together. But now, the one person she trusted most had delivered her to her enemies. "I did this to save lives," Callan said desperately. "But you are risking war over a human." His gaze flickered to Ethan. The disgust was evident. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cold. "She's risking war because your empire is built on lies." Callan glared. "You are nothing but an outsider. You don't understand our world." Ethan smirked. "Maybe not, but I do understand betrayal. The trial of honor." Varric's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Enough talk. It's time for justice." Lizara tensed, expecting immediate execution. But instead, Varric turned to Ethan. "The Empire follows the old laws, and according to tradition, a warrior may earn his freedom through the trial of honor." Lizara's heart pounded. No, the trial of honor was a death sentence. A gladiatorial combat where the challenger faced 3 Xyphorian warlords in a battle to the death. No human had ever survived. Varric's eyes gleamed. You want to prove your worth, human? Then fight for it. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. Fine. Lazara grabbed his arm. Ethan, no, they'll kill you. He turned to her, his voice steady. I won't let them take you. If this is the only way, I'll do it. She searched his eyes for hesitation, for fear, but there was none. Ethan wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for her, the warrior who wouldn't kneel. The next morning, the trial of honor took place in the Grand Celestial Arena, an ancient battleground surrounded by thousands of Cyphorian spectators. Lazara stood at the edge of the royal balcony, her fists clenched. She had never felt so powerless. Ethan stood in the center of the arena, shirt torn, bruises already forming from earlier preparations. The sun cast a golden light over the red sands, where so many warriors had died before him. Then the gates opened. The 3 warlords stepped forward, each one twice Ethan's size, their obsidian armor gleaming under the sun. They were trained for war, bred for destruction. The announcer's voice echoed through the stadium. Let the trial begin. The first warlord charged forward, swinging a plasma axe. Ethan dodged, barely missing a fatal blow. He countered with a swift kick, grabbing the fallen warrior's weapon. 1 down. The second warlord attacked with blinding speed, slamming Ethan to the ground. The impact stole his breath. Blood trickled from his mouth. Lazara felt her heart stop. But Ethan refused to stay down. He rolled, grabbing a blade from the sand, and thrust it through his opponent's chest. 2 down. The final warlord sneered. You should have stayed on your pathetic planet, human. Ethan, breathing heavily, wiped the blood from his lip. Yeah, well, I'm just getting started. The crowd roared, half eager for his death, half stunned that he had lasted this long. Lazara's grip on the balcony tightened. Ethan was fighting for his life. For his freedom. For her. And she had never been more terrified. The human who refused to kneel. The celestial arena roared with the sound of thousands of Cyphorian voices, their chants echoing off the towering obsidian walls. The spectacle before them was unlike anything they had seen before. A human, standing alone against warriors bred for battle. In the center of the crimson sands, Ethan Cole stood bloodied but unbroken. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his body screaming in pain from the brutal combat he had endured. 2 of the 3 Cyphorian warlords lay motionless on the ground, their armor cracked, their weapons fallen beside them. The 3rd warlord, General Corin, a living legend among Cyphorian warriors, circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. From the royal balcony, Princess Lazara watched with her fists clenched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ethan had fought harder and smarter than anyone had expected, but Corin was different. He was the Empire's greatest warrior, undefeated in 100 battles. And Ethan was just a human. Corin tilted his head, his golden eyes filled with something close to amusement. You should be dead by now, Earthborn. Ethan wiped a streak of blood from his lip. Yeah, people keep telling me that. The Cyphorian general smirked, raising his massive plasma-forged warblade, the curved edge gleaming under the alien sun. Let's finish this. The arena fell silent. Then, the final battle began. The fight for survival. Corin charged forward, his warblade cutting through the air with lethal precision. Ethan barely dodged, the razor-sharp edge slicing through the fabric of his torn shirt. He ducked, rolling under the attack, but Corin was too fast. A brutal knee to Ethan's ribs sent him flying backward, crashing into the sand. Lazara gasped. Ethan groaned, forcing himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. He had taken worse hits before. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Corin didn't give him time to recover. He lunged again. This time, Ethan was ready. At the last second, he sidestepped the attack, twisting his body and slamming his elbow into the warlord's side. It was like hitting a wall, but Corrin staggered slightly, a minor victory. Ethan didn't stop. He grabbed a fallen plasma dagger from the sand and drove it toward Corrin's exposed ribs. But Corrin saw it coming. With inhuman speed, he caught Ethan's wrist mid-strike and twisted it. The dagger clattered to the ground. A brutal punch to Ethan's jaw sent him sprawling. Blood pooled in his mouth. Lazara's breath hitched. Varric, standing near the Emperor, smirked. "It's over." Ethan lay in the sand, breathing heavily. Corrin loomed over him, the war blade raised for the final strike. The arena held its breath. Ethan exhaled slowly. Now or never. As Corrin's blade descended, Ethan twisted, grabbing a handful of sand and hurling it into the warlord's eyes. The Xyphorian roared, momentarily blinded. Ethan didn't hesitate. He swept Corrin's legs out from under him, sending the warrior crashing down. Before Corrin could react, Ethan snatched the fallen warblade from the sand and turned it against its owner. He pressed the blade against Corrin's throat. The entire arena fell into stunned silence. Lazara's heart pounded. He did it. Corrin, still panting, locked eyes with Ethan. Then he let out a deep chuckle. "You fight with dishonor." Ethan smirked. "I fight to win." A long pause. Then, to everyone's shock, Corrin nodded. "You have earned my respect, human." Asterisk asterisk, he pushed the blade away from his throat and stood, raising his fist into the air asterisk asterisk. The arena erupted in an uproar. Lazara's breath caught. This wasn't just a victory. This was something much bigger. Ethan had done the impossible. He had won the trial of honor. Varric's last move. The Emperor rose from his throne, his expression unreadable. The human has won. By our laws, he is to be released. Lazara exhaled in relief. But Varric wasn't finished. "My Emperor," he said smoothly, stepping forward, "the trial may be over, but the human is still a danger to the Empire." And what of the princess? She aided in his escape. She betrayed her people. Lazara froze. Varric's golden eyes burned with triumph. There is only one way to restore her honor. The crowd quieted. Then he spoke the words she had been dreading. She must execute him herself. Lazara's blood turned to ice. Ethan stiffened. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." The Emperor's gaze flickered toward his daughter. His silence was an unspoken command. Varric smiled darkly. "Do it, princess. Show your loyalty to your people." A ceremonial blade was placed in Lazara's hands. She stared at it, her entire body trembling. She could still hear the roar of the crowd, still see the way Ethan had fought for his life. For her. Now, they wanted her to kill him. No, she wouldn't. Slowly, Lazara turned to face the crowd. Enough. Her voice rang through the arena, steady and unyielding. "I will not be your puppet." Varric's smug expression faltered. "Lazara, think carefully." "I have." She raised her chin, golden eyes blazing. This trial was meant to prove his honor. He has done that. She turned to her father, her voice firm. "If honor means betraying those who stand by you, then I want no part of it." The Emperor's face was a mask of stone. Varric's fury was barely contained. "She has defied you, my Emperor. You must." But the Emperor raised his hand, cutting him off. For a long moment, he studied his daughter. Then his gaze shifted to Ethan. "Leave." His voice was final. "Take the human and go." Lazara's breath caught. You're letting us go." The Emperor exhaled. "You are no longer my daughter." The word struck like a dagger, but Lazara held her head high. She had already made her choice. She turned to Ethan. "Let's go." Ethan nodded. Gladly. Together, they walked out of the arena, not as a prisoner and a princess, but as two fugitives who had defied an empire. And as they disappeared into the horizon, Lord Varric's glare burned with a silent promise. This was not over. Not by a long shot. The final choice. The sun was setting over the Typhorian wastelands, casting long shadows across the endless crimson dunes. The wind howled, carrying the whispers of an empire left behind. Ethan and Princess Lizara, no, not a princess anymore, walked side by side, each step taking them further away from the palace, from the life she had known, and from the war that was surely coming. Lizara had been disowned, cast out, erased from history. And Ethan, he had become the first human to ever win the trial of honor. But victory didn't feel like triumph. They were fugitives now, hunted by Lord Varric, pursued by an empire that wanted them dead. And yet, for the first time in her life, Lizara felt free. A new path begins. They reached the edge of the abandoned starport, a forgotten relic of an older era, rusted landing pads, long-dead beacons, and ships that hadn't flown in decades. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. Not exactly first-class travel. Lizara gave him a tired smile. It's better than a prison cell. Ethan smirked. Fair point. They moved carefully, checking each docked ship. Most were completely useless, either stripped for parts or overridden by old Imperial codes. Then, they found it. A small stealth-class cruiser, its dark hull covered in dust, but still intact. Ethan ran his hand over the side, whistling. She's old, but she'll fly. Lizara tilted her head. You sure? Ethan grinned. You ever flown with a human pilot before? Lizara crossed her arms. I just watched you crash into a desert. Fair point. Despite everything, they laughed. For a moment, they weren't a former princess and a fugitive soldier. They were just two people, trying to survive. Varric's pursuit. As they began prepping the ship for launch, the warning lights inside flickered. A proximity alert blared across the control panel. Lizara's stomach dropped. We've got company. Ethan checked the sensors. Varric. He's fast. A squad of Typhorian assault ships closed in from the north, cutting off their escape. They weren't here to negotiate. Lizara turned to Ethan. We need to leave. Now. Ethan nodded, racing to the cockpit. As soon as he activated the ship's thrusters, Varric's voice echoed through the comms. You cannot escape forever, Lizara. His tone was cold, controlled. Come back with me, and your life will be spared. Lizara clenched her fists. You know that's a lie. Then at least surrender the human. Varric's voice darkened. He is a disease, Lizara. He has infected your mind, turned you against your own kind. He does not belong in our world. Ethan leaned toward the mic. Yeah, and yet, I keep surviving in it. Weird, huh? Varric's growl of frustration was cut off as the ship roared to life, lifting off the ground. Lizara strapped in as Ethan yanked the controls, sending the cruiser into a steep climb. Blaster fire rained down from above, barely missing their engines. Ethan gritted his teeth. Hold on. Lizara gripped the side of her seat as Ethan spun the ship into a tight spiral, dodging the enemy fire with impossible precision. But Varric's forces were too many. One of the ships locked onto them. A homing missile fired. Lizara's breath caught. Ethan. I see it. Ethan reached for the manual override, shutting off the ship's engines entirely. The cruiser dropped like a stone, the missile overshooting and detonating harmlessly in the clouds. Then, at the last second, Ethan reactivated the thrusters, pulling them into a sharp, gut-wrenching escape trajectory. The stars stretched before them, and in a single burst of speed, they were gone. Beyond the Empire. The ship drifted through uncharted space, the glow of Typhoria now just a distant light behind them. Lizara let out a slow breath, staring at the view beyond the window. For the first time, she was no longer a princess, no longer bound by duty or politics. She had chosen her own fate. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his sore shoulder. So, what now? Lizara turned to him, a small smile forming. You tell me. I've never been exiled before. Ethan chuckled. Well, first rule of being a fugitive: don't die. Lizara smirked. Sounds reasonable. Then, after a pause, she spoke again, softer this time. Thank you, Ethan. He met her gaze. For what? Lizara exhaled. For not letting me fall. He studied her for a moment before offering a small grin. You didn't need me to catch you, Lizara. She tilted her head. No. Ethan leaned forward, holding her gaze. You were flying the whole time. You just didn't know it yet. Silence stretched between them, and for the first time in her life, Lizara felt like she finally understood freedom. The universe was vast, unknown, and dangerous, but she wasn't afraid anymore, because they were in this together. Epilogue. The shadow that remains. Far behind them, in the heart of the Typhorian capital, Lord Varric stood in the Emperor's throne room. His fists were clenched at his sides. The Emperor stared out over his empire, his expression unreadable. They are gone, Varric said through gritted teeth, and the council demands justice. The Emperor's voice was quiet. Justice or war? Varric's eyes burned with fury. The human has made a fool of our traditions, and your daughter. He spat the word like a curse. She is no longer my daughter. The Emperor's tone was final, but there was an undeniable weight behind it. For a long moment, silence filled the throne room. Then, the Emperor turned, his golden eyes sharp. Find them. Varric bowed. I will. He turned on his heel, stepping into the shadows. He would hunt them to the edges of the galaxy. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.